Hi, I'm Konstantin Baum, Master of Wine, and today I'm going to cover a topic that was requested by you guys. I'm going to talk about a country from the other side of the globe, or some might even say from down under, Australia. I will give you an introduction into Aus, and we're going to taste some beautiful wines from Aussie land. So you might even want to say, crikey, mate, or mate, well, anyways, let's go. Some years ago, I traveled through Australia for a while to see the country, taste some wine and surf for a bit. To be honest, I was a little bit disappointed by the countryside because for long stretches it all looks the same, but I was really impressed by the wine culture and the people. Most wineries have cellar doors, so you can just pull up at the winery, taste some wines and learn a little bit about the region and the winery, which is just great. I also think that Australia is constantly evolving, and it used to be associated very much with technical and fairly cheap wines, but today the landscape is far more exciting and diverse. But let's back up a little. Australia is one of the most recent additions to the wine world, and it has grown quickly over the last few centuries. When European settlers arrived first in Aus, there were no wild vines like there were, for example, in North America. The first vineyards were planted in the late 18th century, and the industry grew quickly in the 19th century. Phylloxera also came to Australia in the 19th century, but it did not spread widely, and many wine-growing regions are still phylloxera-free. There was a period in the early 20th century when Australia focused heavily on the production of fortified wine. Rutherglen Muscat is one of the remaining wines from that period, but things changed significantly in the 1950s. Cold fermentation, the use of stainless steel, the focus on high-quality grape varietals and high hygiene levels in the winery improved the quality of Australian wines significantly and made them very reliable, even compared to their old world peers. Today, Australia is well established as a wine-producing country. Most of the wineries can be found in the southeast of Australia, in the states of South Australia and New South Wales. But you can also find some great wines in Western Australia, Tasmania, and to a lesser extent maybe in Queensland. If you think of Australian climate as hot and dry, that's not entirely true. Most of the wine growing regions are influenced by cooling winds from the Pacific, and some regions are actually at higher altitude levels, like for example Orange, that sits above 600 meters in altitude. But Australia can be really hot too, and if you look at the most widely planted grape varieties, you find some warm climate and some cool climate grape varieties: Shiraz, Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot and Sauvignon Blanc. Shiraz is the most widely planted grape variety, and while Australians have adopted the spelling Shiraz, it's actually exactly the same grape variety as Syrah. Over time, it has also become a style descriptor, so if you see wines from other countries labeled Shiraz, they tend to be a little bit richer and more concentrated than Syrahs from the same country. But now let's get into the wines. I have a selection of classics as well as newcomers here, so this tasting should be nice. Let's crack open some bottles, and by the way, I don't actually think I will need this too much today, because in Australia most wines are actually covered under screw caps, even the really good stuff. So the first one is the 2021 Tyrrell Hunter Valley Semillon. The Hunter Valley is in the east of Australia, right outside of Sydney, and it's an interesting region for the grape variety Semillon. The style of the wine is very particular, and I do really like it. The Tyrrell family is very much linked to this wine style. They came to Australia in the 1850s and they planted Shiraz and Semillon, and they're still making the stuff, so they must be doing something right. The average age of the vines is 40 years. The fruit is harvested early in the morning to retain the freshness. It's then fermented in stainless steel, and the wine, well, it's a very low alcohol wine with 11% of alcohol. It's quite fresh, quite delicate, not very aromatic at all, but it gets really complex and interesting with age. So it would actually be a mistake to taste this now because it's 2021, way too young. This is a baby, but I think I have an older vintage somewhere there on one of those shelves. Bear with me. Okay, so this is the 2015 vintage. So this should be a little nicer, a little more complex. So leave this for the future and drink this now. This was definitely the right decision. This is beautiful. It's just coming of age, so it's developing those tertiary, buttery, butterscotch, biscuit flavors. It's really interesting. You gotta taste it to really understand what it is. But once you once you get into it, it's a very easy wine to pick out in a blind tasting because it's so special. It's really light in alcohol. The acidity is fairly high. You have those complex flavors there. It's really animating, really, yeah, it's a beautiful wine. It's a bit of a shame that it's not more popular outside of Australia. In the old world, in Europe, you don't really see it all that often, but it's really good. And this is 10.5% of alcohol, so it's even lower. So it's a low alcohol wine with no sugar. This should be on every wine list, really. And on top of that, this is like $16 retail, so it's fairly cheap. And for me, this is a 93 point wine, so definitely worth seeking out. So the next one is the 2021 Grosset Springvale Riesling from Clare Valley. Clare Valley is a cooler climate, but the wines still tend to have quite a lot of intensity. There's lots of sunshine. So sometimes you get quite intense petrol notes in those wines that can put me off a little bit. But Grosset is one of the best producers in the region, and their wines are pretty amazing usually. So let's see whether this one is. The winery was established in 1981, and they really focused on the grape variety Riesling, really wanted to make great single vineyard Rieslings. And they also were one of the first to champion screw caps at a time when they were not commonplace in Australia. You might now wonder what is the difference between Australian Clare Valley Riesling and German Riesling, for example. And for me, there are some differences. First of all, you oftentimes have quite pronounced petrol notes. They are not so pronounced here. I don't really find them here because they work the grapes really well, but you do find them quite often. But a very distinct fruit flavor that I often get from Australian Rieslings is lime. So you have a very intense lime flavor here, as opposed to more lemon notes in German Rieslings, for example. This wine is super interesting because it has such an intense flavor profile, but it's also delicate in a way. But the great intensity and richness on the palate really shows off the quality of this vineyard and the winery. So the wine is super fresh and vibrant. It's very, very long. It's not broad, but it still has power and intensity. It's a pretty good Riesling. So again, this is a $30 Riesling, and it's just beautiful. I'm actually going to rate this 94 points. I think it is really profound, really, yeah, it has quite a lot of texture and great wine. That's it. So the next one is the 2019 Patrick Sullivan Ada River Chardonnay from Gippsland that retails for around $50. Patrick Sullivan used to work for an importer based in London, and in 2010 he decided to get involved in the Australian wine scene. He went to Gippsland, which is a cool climate region outside of Melbourne, because he wanted to make really fresh and vibrant wines there. The region is very much influenced by the Pacific, so cool Arctic currents that cool down the temperature there quite significantly. So this is actually the only wine for which I need my corkscrew. The grapes come from 40-year-old vines. The juice is fermented spontaneously, put into barriques for 12 months. He claims to be very low intervention, so he farms the vineyards organically or biodynamically and doesn't really add or remove much. So I haven't never tasted the wine before, so let's taste it. By the way, as this is the only cork in this tasting, let me just kind of give the camera a good smack. Well, that wasn't great. Anyways. Let's taste. For a long time, Australian Chardonnays were quite rich, flabby, oaky. Oftentimes they were chipped and not necessarily fermented or aged in barriques. And they were quite boring. But over the course of the last few decades, there were actually more and more winemakers trying to make leaner, fresher wines. Some actually went too far and produced really acidic and harsh Chardonnays. But today, the scene is much more complex. So you actually have quite a few of those big and rich and bulky wines. But you also have some wines that are much more refreshing, much more interesting, much more, well, they have more energy in my opinion. This wine is certainly one of the more new wave wines, made in a fresher and leaner style. It's quite fresh, quite vibrant. The fruit flavor is a bit, well, there's a little bit of lemon, but there's also a little bit of pineapple, a little bit of peachy flavors coming through. And then there's the oak that is quite well integrated, but it's also a little bit sweet. On the palate, it's actually quite fresh, acidic. The alcohol is fairly low. It's at, well, 13%. So it's like medium high. I think this is actually an interesting wine, but it's not the best made Chardonnay in this style. In the finish, you even get some Christmas spice. I don't know whether it's the oak. I think the grapes are a little bit too exotic. Maybe it's the clone or the ripeness level of the fruit, but it's not the most balanced wine. And at $50 retail, it's actually, well, certainly outperformed by the previous two white wines. But it's not a bad wine at all. I would rate this 89 points. I think it's very good, but it's not outstanding. The next one is the 2015 Ocean 8 Aylward Pinot Noir from the Mornington Peninsula, and it retails for around $40. The Mornington Peninsula is close to Melbourne. It's quite cool, and well, the Pacific influence makes it possible to produce really good Pinots. I think this is one of the hotspots for Pinots in Australia. And this is, I think, a winery that has a pretty good reputation. So the winery's name is not a reference to the movie, but it's a reference to golf. But I don't know much about golfing. They started around about 20 years ago, and they've really focused on the Pinot varietals. This wine is made from hand-picked grapes. They were cold soaked for a certain amount of time and then fermented and aged in oak puncheons at 380 liters, apparently, the puncheon, and yeah, out comes this wine. So let's taste it. So again, you might wonder, how does Pinot Noir from Australia compare to Burgundy? And that's kind of difficult. I think Australian Pinots tend to be, in general, very clean, very hygienic. So they don't really have a lot of funk and wild flavors. But this probably has changed quite a bit over the last few years. The wines tend to be more fruit forward, more rich on the palate, more concentrated. But it really depends on the producer and the location of the vineyard. So this is actually fairly light in color. It's not a very dark Pinot. I mean, you can make Pinot in a darker way as well. And this is certainly more on the lighter end. It's also slightly browning. I mean, this is the 2015 vintage, so not a recent vintage. So it's going to be interesting to see how it kind of, well, kept together after 7 years of aging. So this smells of ripe strawberries, a little bit of blackberries as well. There is certainly more berry fruit flavor and more red flavors than dark black flavors coming through. So it's quite a delicate and elegant wine. I don't think that I would age it much longer than this. I think it's right in the window, in the drinking window right now. I don't think it needs more age. On the palate, it has grip and freshness. It's quite complex and complete. I think it's actually really fun. I mean, it's not a very serious Pinot, so I wouldn't rate it super high. I think for me, this is like a 90-point wine. It's interesting, it's juicy, it's fruit forward, but I don't think that it really has many layers. We're moving on to the 2016 Wynns, the siding Cabernet Sauvignon from Coonawarra that retails for around $15. Coonawarra is an Aborigine word meaning honeysuckle, and it's really famous for Cabernet Sauvignon and iron-rich Terra Rossa soils. The Wynn winery, under the lead of John Riddoch, was one of the first to plant vines in the region in 1890, and the siding is actually named after the train line that goes up to Adelaide. It was really important in order to kind of sell wine back in the days when you couldn't just drive up there very quickly. So this is definitely more of an entry-level wine for Wynn, and it's actually made with barriques. So the wine is aged in barriques, but it's also aromatized, I want to say, with staves that you put into stainless steel tanks, usually in order to get some of the oak flavor into the wine, but not necessarily spend all that money on barrels. Coonawarra Cabernet often reminds me of Bordeaux. You find some of the pencil shaving flavors. You also have sometimes some of those green flavors coming through that you don't get in Bordeaux as often today anymore. This certainly has all of that. So it smells of cassis. You also have some oaky flavors coming through. You definitely also got some eucalyptus flavor, in my opinion, which is a great pointer to Australian wines for me. The tannins on the palate are quite grippy. The acidity is quite high. It feels a little bit out of whack. I don't know whether they acidified here, but it feels like the acidity just doesn't sit right. This is more of a commercial wine, I think. It's not necessarily showcasing the beauty of the region and the quality of the producer. It's good though. It's not bad at all. I'm going to rate this 87 points. I think it clearly shows Cabernet Sauvignon characteristics, but it's not necessarily a complex wine. It's something that you just drink on a Tuesday evening with a steak. So the last one is the 2018 Glaetzer Bishop Shiraz from Barossa Valley that retails for $25 US. Barossa Valley is one of the most, if not the most famous wine growing region in Australia. It's outside of Adelaide and it produces rich and concentrated, mostly red wines that can be absolutely outstanding. The Glaetzer family came from Germany and they are very influential in the wine scene, producing great wines. The wines often or always have those symbols from Greek or Egyptian mythology. And the bishop is apparently named after Ben Glaetzer's mother, but don't ask me what his mother has to do with a bishop. I don't know. I don't want to know. So this Shiraz is aged in old and only 5% new hogsheads, so bigger volume barrels. And let's see what it tastes like. So this smells of blackberry, licorice, cassis. It's quite intense and in your face, and it really reminds me of my time in Australia, just traveling around, eating great food from the barbecue and drinking some of this style of wine, like rich and concentrated and hedonistic red wines that can be just beautiful. It's funny how a smell can transport you back in time, and this is happening right now. On the palate, it's actually really juicy, rich. The tannins are there. They are well balanced with the acidity, with the overall body. So it's not a hot, rich and over concentrated wine. It's quite balanced, even though it has 15% of alcohol. Well, I think this is actually a beautiful wine. I like the fact that it's not, super oaky. I think I'm going to rate this 92 points. It's complex, rich, beautiful. Really good Shiraz. Okay, it's actually time for the summary. And this time, the first two wines were just the most beautiful wines in my opinion. And they are both light, vibrant, refreshing white wines. Not necessarily something that you associate directly with Australia, but Australia produces that. So these are certainly worth seeking out. This is much more classic, but I also really liked this Glaetzer Shiraz. And the others were also good. I think not all of them were outstanding, but this was certainly a very interesting tasting to get back into Australia and to travel in time in my head a little bit. So thank you for watching. If you liked this video, then please like it down here. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. My question of the day is, what do you think about Australian wines? Do you drink them or not? Comment down below. Hope I see you guys again soon. Until then, stay thirsty.